Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Pesachim Daf Dalid contains three primarily separate topics. The first is a conclusion of the Gemara's discussion of proper speech. And this will include three stories about the value of speech. One about somebody who was careful with his words to give bad news in a gentle way. And the other two are where you could see things about people from their actual words, from what they say often. The Gemara then goes to the topic of why the mitzvah of B'dikas Chametz is the night before. And then after that, the Gemara will introduce a number of shilas about somebody who rents a house on or about the 14th of Nisan. Where and how does the mitzvah of B'dika, checking the house for Chametz, fall? So first of all, we have our three stories here. So the Gemara says as follows. There was Rav Chia, who his mother and father both had a child from a previous marriage, so that he had a half-brother and a half-sister who were not related to each other. One was from his mother and one was from his father before they were married to each other. That half-brother and sister were named Evu and Ima, and they actually married each other. They had a child whose name was Rav. So Rav was a nephew of Rabbi Chia from both Rabbi Chia's sister and Rabbi Chia's brother. And Rav had not seen Rabbi Chia in quite a while, and Rabbi Chia had not heard an update about his siblings in quite a while. When he did meet Rav, he said, "How is Evo? Is he still alive?" And not wanting to say that he wasn't, Rav said, "Why don't you ask me about Ima?" So he said, "Well, how's Ima? Is she still alive?" And he said, "Well, why don't you ask me about Evu?" And he understood that neither of them were alive, and therefore he had lost both his brother and his sister. So his avelos was as follows. He told his attendant, "Take off my shoes and follow me to the bathhouse. Bring my clothing with me to the bathhouse." So says the Gemara, you learn from his reaction three things. First of all, he had to take off his shoes because he was an avel. He was now in mourning. He had heard that his siblings had passed. So you see that an avel doesn't wear shoes. But we also see that if you hear about the death of a sibling more than 30 days afterward, you don't have a full avelus. You don't have a full shiva. You just have 1 day, and that's why he was going to the bathhouse, even though normally an avel wouldn't go to the bathhouse. And you also see that part of the day counts as the full day. And therefore, once he had already taken off his shoes, he was in Kayim the Avelos, and he doesn't have Avelos anymore, and he can go to the bathhouse straight away. Okay, now our next incident about somebody who you can learn a lot about him from his speech is somebody who used to walk around and everything that happened, he would say, "Take me to court. Take me to court. Let's go to court. I want the judge to decide." The Gemara says he must be from Shevet the Dan, like the pasuk says, Dan Yadin Amayk Achat Shifte Yisrael. Shevet Dan is very into court cases. Then there was somebody, this is our third incident, who used to walk around and always say, "I'm going to build myself a palace on the seashore." Where says he's from Shevet Zvulun, like it says, Zvulun L'chayf Yamim Mishkain. Zvulun likes to live on the banks of the sea. Okay, now the Gemara leaves the topic of proper speech, and the Gemara goes back to the topic of B'dikas Chametz. And we have established that when the Mishnah said you have to do B'dikas Chametz on Orla Ba'asar, it means the night preceding, the night beginning, the 14th of the month of Nisan. And the Gemara's question is why? Chametz only becomes Asar Mid'oraisa to eat or possess at Chatzos on the 14th of Nisan. That's the end of the 6th hour of daylight on the 14th of the month of Nisan. So why would we start doing B'dika an entire night and half a day earlier? It's enough to start doing B'dika an hour before, or however much time it will take you to be finished by the time that the Isha D'Oraisa begins. And if you want to say that, oh well, we want to start early because the reason Makdim in the mitzvahs, you have a mitzvah to do, you jump and you run to do it as fast as you can, so then you should do it in the morning of the 14th. Like we say, the mitzvah of Bris Milah is on the 8th day, and the mitzvah is to do it early in the morning, like Avram did. V'yashkim Avraham Ba'Baker. Avram got up early in the morning in order to do the Akedah. So why the night before? Where does that come from? So the Gemara says there's two reasons. The Gemara says there's two reasons. Reason number one is that people are home at night, and therefore we're going to set up the mitzvah to be done at a time when people are home. During the day, they're not home. The second reason is that we want you to check by the light of a candle, as we shall see in the Gemara later, why specifically the light of a candle. And candlelight doesn't really help much. It doesn't give much light during the day, and therefore we want it to be at night. So says Abaye, so now that we know that we specifically want it to be during the day, so you have to be careful. When the time of Bedika arrives, on the night of the 14th, you should not sit down to a learning seder, and the Rishonim add or to any other thing that takes a long time and can stretch out, lest you come too involved and forget to actually do your Bedika on time, and you'll end up not doing it until the morning. And it's not supposed to be done in the morning, because then you can't use the light of the candle, now that we know that that light is important. Okay, now the Gemara concludes that discussion. Now we go to a list of shailas about renting a house during the time of Bedika, before or after. The first shaila was asked to Rav Nachman by Yitzchak. The question is, if somebody has rented property, he's rented a house on the 14th of Nisan, who has to do Bedikas Chametz? Does he have to do the Bedika because the obligation to check for Chametz is on the person who owns the property and it's his rented property? Or do we say, no, the obligation to get rid of the Chametz is on the one who owns the Chametz, and any Chametz that will be in the house belongs to the landlord because he's the one who just rented it. So any chametz that's in there belongs to him. So who has to take care of the bedika? So the Gemara tries one proof before resolving it, and the proof is from Hilchas Mezuzah. We know that who has to put the mezuzah up? The renter. So obviously the mitzvahs of the house fall on the renter, and therefore the mitzvah of bedika should also fall on the renter. The Gemara says that is not a good proof. The mitzvah of mezuzah goes on the resident. Doesn't matter who the owner is. It goes on the resident. It's there to protect the resident, Rashi adds, and therefore it goes on the resident. So whoever's living in the house is the one that has to put the mezuzah up. That's not a question. Here the question is, the chiyuv bedika falls upon the one who has it in his house or the one who owns the chametz. That's the issue. We don't know whether the chiyuv applies to the resident, it applies to the owner, or does it apply to the owner of the chametz? And that can't be figured out from Hilchas Mezuzah. So Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak answered, he says we have a clear indication that there's a brisa that says that the obligation to check for chametz goes on whoever owned, including renting, owning, whoever owns, whoever has control of the property at the time that the 14th begins. At the time that the obligation to do Bedikas Chametz hits, at the time that it starts, which is at sunset, on nightfall, on the evening of the 14th, the evening preceding the 14th of the month of Nisan, whoever has control of the apartment then is the one who has the chiyuv bedika falling on him. How do you know who has control over it? Well, control is transferred when the keys are given over. So if the keys were given before that moment, then it goes to the renter. And if the keys are still at the landlord and they were given over on the 14th, later than that, then the obligation fell and remains on the owner, the landlord. The Gemara's next shaila is also asked of Nachman bar Yitzchak, and that is somebody who rents a house on the 14th, meaning he took possession of the keys after the chiyuv bedika began, so the chiyuv bedika was on the landlord. So the question is, can you assume that the landlord did the job? Is there a chazaka, is there a valid assumption that you're allowed to go with that the landlord did his mitzvah, had a mitzvah bedika, can you assume that he performed it and therefore you don't have to do bedika again? So the Gemara says, why don't you just ask him? The Gemara says, the cases where he's not around to ask him, the question is, do I have to go through an entire bedika as a renter, or can I assume he did? So Nachman Yitzchak attempts to bring a proof from a brisa. The brisa discusses a situation where all you have left to a house is a woman, child, or a slave, and they have minimal nemanas. They aren't believed, they cannot testify that bedika was done. However, the brisa says that if they tell you that bedika was done, you don't have to do bedika again. So Rav Nachman Yitzchak says, since they can't testify, what would the reason be? The reason must be that we assume that the homeowner did the bedikas chametz. There's a chazaka that he did it, and therefore here you see a clear proof that you could assume that the homeowner did bedikas chametz. Now the explanation for why we would have this assumption would be because everybody's into bedikas chametz. People are very careful with chametz. The halachas yofal chametz carefully, and therefore everybody counts as a chaver. Chaver is a status of people's close keeping of mitzvahs. We see the halacha of chaver concerning meiser. If somebody has produce and he left the produce, let's say he died, even on the day that the produce became chayv and meiser, the day that you created the heap and smoothed it out, the day that it was chayv and meiser, you could assume that he took meiser from it and you could eat it without taking meiser again. And the reason is because he's a chaver, this is referring to someone who has the status of chaver. A chaver, you could assume he took care of the mitzvah right away. As far as chametz, everybody counts as a chaver. Everybody's careful with the mitzvah of getting rid of chametz. Anyway, so what we see from here is that you could assume that he did the mitzvah. We see that because it wouldn't make sense otherwise to believe the woman, the child, or the slave. So the Gemara says, but that can't be the case, because if you're right, then it should say that we believe, that we assume that every house is checked. It's nothing to do with a woman, a child, or a slave standing there and telling you. It should be true even without them telling you. Obviously, this is not a halacha that has anything to do with chazaka. We're talking about a situation where chazaka is not relevant. All right, you can't prove either way. You can't prove that there is no chazaka and therefore you need the woman and the child to tell you, because this whole mission is not about chazaka. It's not talking about chazaka. It's talking about the belief, the trustworthiness of the woman, the child, and the slave. So we're talking about a case where chazaka is not relevant. What would that be? Either we know he didn't check, or we could see that he didn't have an opportunity to check. So there's no chazaka. The question is, are they believable? And this price is telling you they are believable, even though normally you wouldn't accept their edus. Since the mitzvah of checking a house for chametz is a dir rabbanon, midaraisa, all you have to do is bittul. All you have to do is mentally disengage from this chametz and consider it valueless. So what's only the chachamim said you have to check. They said you have to check, and they said we're going to accept the testimony of a person who doesn't usually have trustworthiness. As far as saying testimony, we will accept it for the halacha of checking for chametz. Okay, the Gemara's next question about a renter is the following. Let's say you rented a house on the understanding that it was checked already. You had discussed with the homeowner and the landlord, and he said, I'm renting you this house, it's checked. You get to the house, you find chametz all over the floor. It's obviously not checked. Question is, can you now claim that the rental contract is void, and you want your money back, and you're giving the guy the house back? So Abaye said, no, you can't. And Abaye interestingly said that there's two types of places. In some places, people usually hire somebody to check for chametz, and in some places, they usually do it themselves. Why would you sometimes hire, some places hire and some places check themselves? Well, people who check themselves obviously prefer to do the mitzvah themselves. They want to do it themselves. Somebody like that, you can't assume the assumption is that he likes to do the mitzvah, and therefore if he finds that the house is not checked, he's really happy doing the bedika. He wants to do the mitzvah of bedikas chametz himself. Why is he complaining? Obviously, he found a different house somewhere else, and he wants out of this deal. So therefore, it's not a reason to back out. Now, in a case where people usually hire somebody, therefore you can't say that people around here like to do the mitzvah themselves. They don't. It's a monetary issue, and now he has to go spend money to hire somebody. Still, Abaye says people like doing mitzvahs with their money, and they like going to hire somebody, and the guy doesn't really have a problem with the fact that he has to go hire somebody to do bedika. He likes doing the mitzvah with his money. His actual problem is that he found that house somewhere else than he wants, and he wants out of this deal, and therefore he's not allowed to cancel this deal. Okay, now, the end of the daf here, the Gemara discusses when exactly is the time of bedikas, when exactly is the time up to which one is allowed to eat chametz, and when is the time up to which one is allowed to own chametz. So, the Gemara says it's clear that midde oiraisa, the obligation to be free of chametz, to destroy all chametz which you own, the mitzvah of tashbisu and the isser to own chametz begins chatzos, begins midday of the 14th of the month of Nisan of Erev Pesach. Midday is the end of the 6th hour of the day. Now there's a machlokes when the Rabbanon said you have to make the time earlier to avoid mistakes. Rav Meir says you can eat chametz until the end of the 5th hour, and that's when you should destroy the chametz as well. You have up until the end of the 5th, so it's 1 hour earlier than the d'oraisa time. We back it up 1 hour. That's when you should. That's when you can't eat anymore midrabanan, and that's when you have to burn it midrabanan. Now Rabbi Yehuda says no. We back up the time of eating an hour before that. You shouldn't eat anything after the end of the 4th hour. Then you have 1 hour in which you're allowed to own it, and you don't have to burn it yet. And at the end of the 5th hour, you should burn it, and they should be well clear of the 6th hour, which is an hour later. By the time that rolls around, chametz should be long burnt, long checked, and not being eaten anymore. Okay, now the Gemara says this, fine, but where is the source for this halacha that chametz becomes aser at chatzos? I thought chametz becomes aser on Pesach. How do you know that it's aser midday from Erev Pesach? So the Gemara says, because we have two psukim which seem redundant. One says, Shivas Yamim Sar Lo Yimatzi B'Vatechem, you can't have any chametz in your house for 7 days. And then it says, Ach B'Yam Rishon Tashbisu Sar Mi'Batechem, on the first day you should destroy the chametz. Now how does that fit together? You can't have chametz in your house all 7 days, you can't destroy it on the first day. Obviously it means you have to destroy it the day before. So the day before is when you're supposed to destroy it, so that should be from concise. So Gemara says, but why concise? Maybe you're supposed to destroy it at night. It said 7 days you can't have it in your house, so maybe that means 7 daylight hours, 7 periods of daylight hours you can't have chametz. But the night of Pesach, maybe you could have chametz, and you're supposed to destroy it at night. That way, when sun rises, you will have 7 days of no chametz. Gemara says that can't be, because we know that chametz, in the midst of destroying chametz, is when it is forbidden to eat chametz. And it's forbidden to eat chametz when you're supposed to be eating matzah. Those three halachas are connected, based on 3 psukim. It says, Shivas Yom Sar Lo Yimatzi B'Vatechem, Ki Kol Echam Achmetzes V'Nichos L'Nefashim Me'edas Yisrael Be'Ger Ve'Ezrach Ha'aretz. You can't have chametz, being it's connected, you can't eating chametz. And it says, Kol Machmetzes Lo Yizechel B'Chol Ma'ish V'Yisechem Toich Lo Matzais. It connects eating matzah to not having chametz. So all those three have to be the same time. We know the mitzvah of eating matzah is Pesach night, and therefore we know that it's forbidden to have chametz or to eat chametz on Pesach night. It's got to be destroyed before that. The extra pasuk that says destroy it earlier must be telling me already to destroy it from concise.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.